for our February 2024 podcast. My name is Chad Tyler, and I'm here with my colleague, Charles Shapiro. Charles, you want to say hi and introduce your topics you're going to cover today?
Yes, Chad. Hello, everyone. Hey, Chad, I just saw you a few days ago. You didn't look like you got beaten up. What's with your forehead?
Well, Charles, I'm glad you noticed that. This industry is tougher than everybody thinks. You've heard a lot about the difficulties in the commercial real estate market today, and I'm living proof of that.
Well, heal up, Chad. So today I'm going to cover two subjects. The first one is, when should you start looking for new office space, warehouse space, retail space? The next one is, you've just signed the lease. Now what? And it's more important than you think. Chad, what about you?
So I'm going to start us off here, Charles, and I'm going to cover different rates of return in real estate. Specifically, I'm going to look at the cap rate, capitalization rate, and also the cash on cash return. So let me pull up some information on that, and then we'll get into that. So, as I said, we're going to talk about the often misunderstood capitalization or cap rate, as it's referred to. When we're looking at real estate, in particular income producing properties, there's different types of returns we might want to consider or look at. So we look at the cap rate, but we also want to look at the cash on cash return. We may look at the internal rate of return and also what's called the discounted cash flow. So just by definition, Investopedia says that the capitalization rate is used in the world of commercial real estate to indicate the rate of return that is expected to be generated on a real estate investment property. Well, I think that's very vague. So I think the most important thing is, in terms of understanding the cap rate, it's a non-leverage rate of return. So it assumes that you're not using any debt. And just mathematically, the capitalization rate is the net operating income of a given property divided by the purchase price. So as a matter of ease to remember, we refer to it as the IRV formula or IRV formula, where I equals the net operating income, R equals the rate or the capitalization rate, and V is the value. So just to work through an actual example, let's assume that you're looking at a property and it has a net operating income of $150,000. The asking price on that property is $2 million. So in this case, the cap rate would be 7.5%. We take the $150,000 and divide it by the price of $2 million. So drilling down into it a little bit more, it's important to understand that when you are looking at the net operating income, by definition, it does not include debt service. So here I have an example of just calculating the net operating income. So in this case, we have a property that has gross income of $175,000. And then down below, we have what would be typical operating expenses, things like property taxes, insurance, property management fees, repairs and maintenance, things of that nature. But what we don't see is a debt service line item, which is appropriate for the net operating income. So in this case, we see that we've got $175,000 gross income less the operating expenses. We get down to net operating income of $151,320. The other thing I would mention as it relates to the net operating income is, when you're looking at a property, it's important that you look at that on an average of at least 3 years. So you don't want to just look at 1 year's net operating income, because that could be erroneous in one form or another. But you look at an average of 3 years. So as I said, by definition, the net operating income does not include debt service. The other thing that is sometimes overlooked with regards to the cap rate is not including a vacancy factor. So let's look at some of the shortcomings as it relates to the cap rate. Number one, the cap rate assumes that the property is not bought with any financing, which is very rarely the case. In addition to that, the cap rate also ignores other related costs that you have when acquiring a property beyond the purchase price. So, for example, you have things like transfer taxes, you have recordation fees, you might have some legal fees, lender fees, you might have some fees involved in doing due diligence and studying the property. So those add to your costs and acquire the property above and beyond the purchase price. In addition to that, the cap rate also ignores future escalations, both in rents that are often built into leases, as well as increases in operating expenses. In addition to that, the cap rate often will ignore any kind of a vacancy factor as well. So before I move in to what we consider to be a better rate of return, which is the cash on cash rate of return, Charles, is there anything that you feel I might have missed there on the cap rate, or anything you want to comment on as it relates to the capitalization rate?
Well, not really, except that, what we've generally used cap rate for is to compare properties at a very basic level. You're always wondering when someone throws out a cap rate, how they're calculating that cap rate, but you really want to use it to compare property A to property B on a very topical basis. The other thing, and this is the question for you, as cap rates go up, or as if they go up, the price of the property goes down. If you have a small cap rate, the price of properties go up. With the fact that interest rates are going up and you and I can buy a T-bill at 5% interest, what do you see happening to cap rates, and how do you see that relating to the price of properties?
Yeah, so that's a good point and a good question. I mean, definitely right now with interest rates rising, overall cap rates are increasing as well in the marketplace. And as you know, Charles, as many of our listeners know as well, the cap rate is going to vary based upon property type. So if we have a single tenant, Truist Bank lease property, a 20-year lease, very strong tenant, that's low risk. So that cap rate is going to be low. That rate of return is going to be low. But if we have a multi-tenant property with a variety of tenants, not necessarily credit rated, those cap rates will be a little bit higher. And then, as you said, with interest rates rising, overall cap rates for all the different property types is also rising. So with that, let's move into the cash on cash return here. And I'm going to grab my slides back here. Yeah, so the cash on cash rate of return, it considers, all of the different costs that go into buying the property beyond just the purchase price. In addition to that, very importantly, it includes the debt service, which most people, again, will secure a loan when buying a property. It also considers a vacancy factor as well. So as an example, in this case, let's say that you're buying a property for $1.5 million, so $1,500,000. You've determined that you're going to have extra cost in buying that property of $50,000. So your total acquisition in terms of cash outlay is $1,550,000. You're going to place a loan on this property of $900,000. So you're actually going to have cash invested of $650,000. In addition to that, the current gross rent on this property is $175,000. But when you look at the local marketplace and you consider like-kind properties, you're seeing that overall they have an average of a 5% market vacancy rate. So we're going to discount that gross rent by 5%, and we're going to get down to what we call an effective rent of $166,250. In addition to that, we've determined that the operating expenses on this property are $30,000, and that our debt service, based upon the $900,000 loan we're placing with a 20-year amortization and a 7% interest rate, works out to be debt service expense of $83,732. So when we take our effective rent, $166,250, less the operating expenses, and then less the debt service expense, we get down to net income, not net operating income, but net income after debt service of $52,518. So our cash on cash return in this case is our $650,000 divided into the net income of $52,518, which works out to a rate of return, a cash on cash rate of return of 8%. So we compare that to what we get if we look at just the cap rate, which we would use our $175,000 gross income. We would take off the $30,000 in operating expenses, getting us to net operating income of $145,000 divided by the price of $1.5 million. That gets us to a cap rate of 9.6%. So it's higher, and it's erroneously higher. So again, for the reasons we mentioned, we think the cash on cash rate of return is a better rate of return. I'm going to summarize the reasons why. Number one, as I said, it takes into consideration all of the acquisition costs beyond the price. In addition to that, it also takes into consideration the debt service annual expense associated with that. In addition to that, it also considers the vacancy rate. So I'm going to stop there. And Charles, I'm going to let you pick it up and hit on the topics that you laid out earlier.
Very good. Thank you, Chad. So the first thing we want to discuss, what I want to discuss today, is when to start your search for new space. Because here is the challenge. Most people, when they're looking for new space, they start late in the process, they're rushed, and they're not able to really make the best possible decision. So when should you start looking for space? That depends. That's a great legal answer. That depends. Large firms, your Amazons, international law firms, they may look years in advance. I remember when I was living in Washington, D.C., one law firm signed a lease on a building that wasn't built yet, and they were going to start occupying there in 7 years. So obviously their strategic planning started well in advance. So large firms, Amazon, when they look for their new headquarters, they were planning that years and years and years in advance, and they're still getting into some of that space. So what should you do? The first thing you need to do is look at your current lease. Is there a renewal clause in the lease? Most people will remember there was a renewal clause, but they won't remember what the terms were. Do you have to give notice of your intent to renew? When do you have to do that? Do you have to do it 90 days in advance? Do you have to do it 120 days in advance? Do you have to do it 6 months in advance? For bigger leases, you might have to give your notice a year in advance. You need to know this stuff. Now, understand that you don't need to renew your lease under any terms that you don't like, but you need to know what those terms are. This will give your company enough time to make a great decision, and that is the bottom line. So what I recommend is that you start really looking almost a year in advance. We'll get to that in a second. But if you want to renew your lease well in advance, start investigating what you want to do, and make sure you're looking at that lease and saying, okay, what does the market look like? I might want to look 6 to 8 months before I need to give notice just to see what the market is. Because let's just say market is much less than the rate that you're going to have to renew at. You may just want to consider, negotiating a renewal and not want to renew under the terms of your formal lease renewal. So, as I just said, start at least a year in advance or 6 to 8 months before you have to give notice. Then, I think I closed this. I apologize. I'm going back to where I was. Okay. So a year in advance gives you a chance to sit down with your team members and your broker and really understand what's going on in the market. What usually happens is that they don't do that because it's not something that's critically important to do at that point. But when you get into the process, you're going to realize that you're much better off for understanding the market. So what you want to decide, in that strategic analysis is, does your space work for you? Is it going to be able to handle your short and long-term needs? Is the lease, signed at the right rate? What do you want to do as a company? So there's lots and lots of questions that you need to answer. And at that time, and this is where your broker comes in, you get to evaluate current market conditions. So let's just say that your lease renewal is 5% above your current lease rate. You're paying $40, so you're going to have to pay $42 a square foot for rent. But let's just say market's at $35. Of course, you're not going to renew under those terms. What if, like today in the office market, we're seeing higher concessions, higher tenant improvement allowances? You need to take that into account. And the longer that you have to plan, understand the market, and understand what your needs are and what your choices are in the market, the better off you are. So start your search early. If you're a retailer, start them early. You might want to go into a center that's about to be built, hasn't been built, but is about to be built. So if you're looking for a warehouse, you may need to have 30-foot ceiling heights or 40-foot ceiling heights, and that may not be in the marketplace. So do plan this in advance, because you might have to look at new buildings or something that's going to be built later to take care of your needs. So that is the first thing I want to discuss. The second thing I want to discuss is, now that you've signed your lease, what now? So let me just tell you something. Most people just take the lease and they put it in a file. The first thing you want to do, and that's not on my list of things to do, is digitize your lease. Digitize it, know where it's at so that you can look for it if you need it. And I'm going to give you an example of a client that I was working with. This client is a group of psychiatrists and very good at what they do, but they didn't know anything about their lease. So a corporation signed the lease. There were 3 people that were part of that corporation. One was leaving the firm. And so they said, well, what does that mean for our lease? What does that mean for our lease? And I said, well, wait a second. You signed a personal guarantee where all 3 had to guarantee the lease. So I pulled the lease out for them. And guess what? That guarantee went away. Actually, it is at the end of February, it goes away. So that partner who's just leaving the firm, she's off the hook completely. And they didn't know that. They didn't remember that. And frankly, they couldn't find their lease. So if I was not in the business and I couldn't do it for them, they wouldn't have known where to go or what to do. They also were under the impression that, 3 of them had to pay the lease. And I said, no, the corporation has to pay the lease. And frankly, they don't care. They just want to get their rent every month. So next, once you've signed your lease and you've moved in, you know all the dates, make sure that you're on top of what is the lease commencement date? When does the lease start? When is the rent commencement date? Meaning, when does the rent start? So if you have 4 months of free rent commencement is 4 months later. Know what the termination date is and put that onto your calendar. Make sure that it's sitting there. Know when you have to give lease renewal notifications. So if you have a 5-year lease with a 5-year option, make sure that's on the calendar, and then make sure what's on the calendar is that 5, 6 months, 6, 8 months before that, you're starting to look at the market. Put that on your calendar. So rent increase dates. I would put on every date where there's a rent increase, I would put rent increase, and then this is what it's going to be so that you don't have any questions about that and what the amounts are. And then, as we just said a second ago, we want to find out when we have to start our strategic analysis for our other needs. So what else? You'll want to look at the insurance provisions. So the insurance provisions will tell you how much insurance you have to get, and that's what you have to do. So make sure you know exactly what you have to do. Note what you're responsible for maintaining. You may be a retailer and the landlord is going to tell you that you have to maintain the air conditioning system and they're going to have you on a schedule. So make sure it's on a schedule that if you have to get it maintained every 6 months, that you're doing exactly that. You may be responsible for landscaping. You may not be. You may be responsible for trash removal. You may not be. That's all in the lease. Make sure you have that lease in hand so you know that. Also, pay close attention to expenses. You're going to get a list of expenses. If you have a triple net lease or a full service lease, you're still going to get a list of expenses paid by the landlord. You're going to want to go back to your lease and see if certain expenses are covered. So let's just say they repaved the parking lot or they put in a new heating system in the building and the landlord's trying to get you to pay part of it. Well, you may not have to pay part of that based on what was negotiated in the lease, what's considered a capital expense, which generally the tenant should not have to pay for, and what is an operating expense, which obviously the tenant should be a part of. Note that if there's any limits on the expense increases, one thing Chad and I believe in is working with our tenants to make sure that expense increases are controlled. And make sure you know what can be expensed and what can't be expensed, which is what we said earlier. So, know all your management contacts, and keep your lease close at hand. Chad, I just went over a whole bunch of stuff really, really quickly about the lease and when to start your process. Can you add anything that I might have missed or anything that could be helpful?
Sure. Just a couple of points of emphasis. As Charles mentioned, if you're looking, let's say, a year out for space, depending upon what kind of space you're looking for, what type of user you are, if you find the ideal space maybe a little bit earlier than you expect or maybe want, there sometimes, very often, is the opportunity to get some rental abatement on that new space to help bridge the gap to allow you to move forward sooner than later. The other thing Charles mentioned is that sometimes you might be considering moving or possibly staying where you are. And for argument's sake, let's just say you have 18 months left on your existing lease. Well, in today's market, particularly in the office market, it's a very good opportunity to go back in and renegotiate your lease now, get an extension, but take advantage of the reduced rates that are in the marketplace with some property types, in particular office. So we generally refer to that as blend and extend, but it's a very plausible and good opportunity in today's market. So I think with that, we're gonna wrap it up. Again, we really appreciate you taking the time to join our podcast this month, and please thank Tyler, Duncan, Realty Partners, for all your commercial real estate needs. You have our contact information on the screen, and have a great day.